I never thought I'd be the target of home invasion by packing peanuts, but when you live in Oak Ridge Estates with Deborah Winters as your HOA president, expect the unpredictable. I'm James Mitchell, a 38-year-old software developer who values peace and quiet above most things. I bought my simple three-bedroom home in this suburban paradise 5 years ago, before Deborah, or as the neighborhood now calls her, Dictator Deb, seized power in our homeowners association. My troubles began last spring when I decided to renovate my home office. Working remotely full-time meant I needed a more efficient space. So I ordered new furniture that arrived in several large boxes. Naturally, these deliveries included mountains of those white styrofoam packing peanuts that seem to increase when you're not looking. I neatly broke down the boxes for recycling and bagged the packing materials for proper disposal, placing everything in my garage until collection day. Little did I know that Deborah had been observing my deliveries from her window across the street. She had recently implemented a new HOA rule that all unsightly waste materials must be removed from properties within 24 hours of delivery, a rule that was buried on page 47 of her newly revised 60-page HOA guidelines that nobody actually read. Frankly, I wouldn't have been surprised if she printed it in hidden ink just to catch people breaking rules they didn't know existed. The morning after my deliveries, I was deep in a work meeting when my doorbell rang with such persistence that I thought there might be an urgent situation. I excused myself from my Zoom call and opened the door to find Deborah standing there in her signature pastel pantsuit, clipboard in hand, pearls gleaming in the morning sun, and a smile that never reached her eyes. "Good morning, James," she said with fake sweetness. "I couldn't help but notice the excessive packaging waste accumulating in your garage, according to Section 12, Paragraph 9 of our community guidelines. All packaging materials must be disposed of within 24 hours of delivery. It's now been." She made a show of checking her designer watch. 26 hours and 18 minutes. I took a deep breath, maintaining my calmness. Deborah waste collection isn't until Thursday. The garage is closed, so nothing is visible from the street. I don't see how this could possibly be an issue. Her smile tightened. "Rules are rules, James. We can't have one homeowner thinking they're above our community standards. I'm issuing you a warning, and if those materials aren't gone by noon, there will be a $100 penalty." She handed me a pink slip of paper with the violation meticulously detailed in her perfect handwriting. "This is nonsense," I said, but took the warning anyway. "I'll handle it when my workday is finished." Noon, James. Not a minute later. With that, she pivoted on her heel and marched back to her flawless home with its perfectly trimmed hedges and color-coordinated flower beds that adhered to the HOA-approved palette. I returned to my meeting, irritated but determined not to let Deborah ruin my day. At precisely 12:01, my phone pinged with an email notification. An official HOA fine for noncompliance. Attached was a photo of Deborah standing in my driveway, pointing at her watch. The woman had actually documented herself intruding on my property to issue a fine 60 seconds after her made-up deadline. This wasn't my first run-in with Deborah. Previous incidents included citations for grass being a quarter too tall, having an unapproved shade of white paint on my fence. Apparently, there are 50 shades of white in Deborah's world, and I had chosen wrong. And once for leaving my garage door open for 30 minutes while I unloaded groceries, but this time felt different, more personal, more intrusive. That evening after work, I moved the packing material to my backyard shed out of sight. I also took the opportunity to install a security camera system I've been meaning to set up for months. Something told me I might need evidence of Deborah's activities in the future. I wasn't planning anything yet, but as my father always said, better to have and not need than need and not have. The next few weeks were quiet, too quiet in retrospect. I should have recognized this as the calm before the storm. Deborah was suspiciously absent from her usual neighborhood patrol rounds. I later learned she was attending an intensive 3-day workshop called Mastering HOA Enforcement Zero Tolerance Techniques. I shudder to think what they teach at those things probably include the section on waterboarding homeowners who dare to hang unapproved holiday decorations. My big transgression came when I received a large shipment of computer equipment for my job. The delivery company left about 20 boxes on my porch while I was out grocery shopping. By the time I returned, Deborah had already photographed the eyesore and sent a mass email to all residents about how my blatant disregard for community aesthetics, threatens property values, she gave me 1 hour to clear everything. Being a reasonable adult who doesn't respond well to unreasonable demands, I took my time bringing the packages. Inside, I had frozen items to put away and a conference call scheduled. The boxes would have to wait. Apparently, this was my declaration of war in Deborah's mind that night. I received another fine this one. For $200, I replied to the email, explaining that the boxes were delivered while I was out and were removed within a reasonable time frame. Deborah's response was to schedule an emergency HOA meeting about problematic residents undermining community standards. She didn't name me specifically, but the timing made it obvious who she meant. I decided not to attend the meeting. Instead, I spent the evening researching HOA laws in our state and discovered that many of Deborah's rules weren't legally enforceable. I drafted a polite but firm email to the entire HOA board citing relevant legal statutes and requesting a review of recent fines. I also mentioned that I'd be happy to discuss this with a real estate attorney. If necessary, I never directly threatened legal action, but the implication was clear. The next morning, I woke up to find my fines had been temporarily suspended. Pending review, a small victory, but I knew Deborah wouldn't take this challenge to her authority lightly. Little did I know how far she was willing to go. Friday afternoon, I left town for a weekend technology conference. I informed my neighbors on either side that I'd be gone until Sunday evening, standard practice in our neighborhood for security purposes. What I didn't realize was that Deborah had been watching and waiting for exactly this opportunity. According to my security cameras, which I could access remotely, she spent Friday night peering through my windows and testing my doors on. Saturday morning, she returned with 2 men in unmarked coveralls. What happened next still astounds me. Deborah produced a key. Later, I learned she had convinced the previous HOA president to make copies of everyone's spare keys for emergency purposes and let herself and the workers into my house. The security footage showed them carrying large bags of what I would later discover were packing peanuts, industrial quantities of them. The men spent 2 hours inside my home while Deborah supervised from my front lawn, occasionally checking her watch and scanning the neighborhood to ensure no one was watching. I received an alert from my security system about the motion detection, but assumed it was a false alarm since the system recognized Deborah as a previously recorded visitor. It wasn't until that evening, when I checked the footage, that I realized something was very wrong. I immediately called my neighbor Michael and asked him to check on my house. His call came 20 minutes later. James, he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and poorly suppressed laughter. You need to come home right now. Your entire house is filled with packing peanuts, like literally filled. They're spilling out. When I opened the door, what the hell happened? I was speechless. Deborah happened. I finally managed. Don't touch anything else. I'm calling the police. I drove home that night instead of waiting until Sunday, my mind racing with questions. Why would Deborah do something so extreme? How did she get so many packing peanuts? Most importantly, how was I going to prove she was behind this? When I arrived home at 11 p.m., 2 police officers were waiting with Michael. Opening my front door, unleashed an avalanche of white styrofoam peanuts that cascaded onto my front lawn like a bizarre winter wonderland. The officers' expressions were priceless, a mixture of confusion and the professional struggle not to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Sir, one officer began clearing his throat. Can you explain what happened here? I showed them the security footage. The video clearly showed Deborah directing the workers as they carried bag after bag of packing materials into my home. The officers took statements and copies of the footage explaining that this constituted breaking and entering at minimum, with additional charges possible for property damage once we assessed the extent of it. And the extent was staggering. Every room in my house was filled nearly to the ceiling with packing peanuts. My furniture, electronics, clothing, everything was buried. The static electricity made the peanuts cling to every surface. They had even been poured into my kitchen cabinets, my refrigerator, and yes, my toilet. As I stood in my living room watching packing peanuts float gently through the air with every movement. I realized that Deborah had actually done me a favor. She had crossed the line from annoying HOA president to criminal trespasser, and she had done it on camera. The officers left to pay Deborah a visit while I began the monumental task of clearing my home. Michael helped, as did several other neighbors who showed up after hearing about the incident through our neighborhood text chain. By 3 a.m., we had cleared enough of my living room and bedroom to make them usable, with mountains of bagged peanuts filling my garage and driveway. At 7 a.m. sharp, my doorbell rang. It was Deborah, looking considerably less polished than usual. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled, and her expression suggested she had not slept well. After her conversation with the police, James, she began, her voice uncharacteristically shaky. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I leaned against my door frame, arms crossed. Is that what we're calling breaking into my home and filling it with packing materials? A misunderstanding that's not. I mean, it was meant to be a lesson about proper disposal of packaging materials. You've repeatedly violated HOA guidelines, and I thought a practical demonstration would help you understand the importance of. I held up my hand to stop her. Save it for your attorney. Deborah, mine will be contacting you today. Her face crumpled. Please, James, this will ruin me. I could lose my job. Deborah worked as a public relations director for a major corporation, and a criminal record would indeed jeopardize her position. You should have thought of that before you broke into my house. I replied, not unkindly but firmly. Actions have consequences. What do you want? She whispered. I'll do anything to make this right. I considered her offer. I didn't actually want to ruin her life, but she needed to understand the importance of her actions. For starters, you can pay for professional cleaning of my entire house, every room, every item of clothing, every electronic device that might have been affected. Then you're going to resign from the HOA board. Finally, you're going to apologize to every homeowner for your abuse of power. She nodded quickly, relief washing over her face at the realization that I wasn't pressing for maximum punishment. Yes, of course, anything. One more thing, I added. Where did you even get that many packing peanuts? Deborah looked at the ground. My brother owns a shipping company. I told him I needed them for a community project. I couldn't help but laugh. Well, I guess it was a community project in a way, just not the kind he imagined. The professional cleaning crew arrived that afternoon, the most expensive service in the city, which Deborah paid for without complaint. It took 3 days to completely rid my house of packing peanuts. Some are probably still hiding in corners I haven't discovered yet. The cleanup bill came to just over $11,000, which included special treatment for my electronics and detailed cleaning of every vent and crevice in the house. Deborah resigned from the HOA board the following Monday. Her replacement, a retired judge named Barbara, immediately instituted a more reasonable approach to community guidelines. As for Deborah's promised apology, she delivered it at the next community meeting, though I suspect her contrition had more to do with avoiding criminal charges than genuine remorse. The most satisfying consequence came 3 weeks later, when Deborah's company transferred her to their office in another state. Apparently, her employers weren't thrilled about having an executive who broke into homes to fill them with packing materials. The neighborhood threw a farewell party after she left. The first time I had seen some of my neighbors actually smiling in years. As for me, I've developed a strong aversion to packing peanuts. I now request alternative packaging materials for all deliveries, but every time I find a stray peanut that escaped the cleaner's notice, I smile, thinking of Deborah's face when she realized her petty revenge had backfired so spectacularly. The new HOA board under Barbara's leadership has reduced our 60-page rule book to a reasonable 10 pages of common sense guidelines. My security system remains in place, though, and I've changed all my locks in suburbia. You never know when when the next Deborah might move in. Clipboard in hand and vengeance in heart, ready to enforce their vision of neighborhood perfection, one violation at a time.